Hi and welcome. My name is Beth Rizzo, and on today's LinkedIn Live, I'm joined by JT, Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of GEP, and Josh Matthews, Practice Leader at HFS. On today's Live, we will be discussing the sustainable outlook for 2023, trends, challenges, and opportunities. I personally have been looking so forward to this session and hearing the insights from this esteemed panel, as I know I'm sure you have as well. So prior to kicking off this session, I wanted to take the opportunity to introduce JT and Josh. JT oversees GEP's operations. Under his leadership, the company has grown into a leading procurement and supply chain, consulting, outsourcing, and tech firm. JT has been an advocate for sustainability efforts internally within GEP and externally. Josh Matthews is a practice leader at HFS based in Cambridge, UK. Josh leads HFS's coverage of sustainability and the energy and utilities industry's business. Josh also covers supply chain as part of a broader HFS team. Just a couple of things prior to starting so that you know what to expect. We will be having a discussion and an exchange of ideas with Josh and JT for a little over a half an hour, and then we'll be addressing Q&A. But please don't let that stop you from entering questions into the chat because we're receiving those throughout the discussion, and we look forward to hearing what questions you have for our panel. Now, off to you, Josh.
Hey, thanks so much, Beth. And yeah, as much as I like you, JT, I think we could do with something to break up the two of us talking for an entire hour. Something to maybe cut through the maybe some optimism, but I'd imagine a lot of it is going to cover the realistic state of sustainability going into 2023. And I think generally just trying to do our best and hopefully give clarity on how to not get too overwhelmed by just the enormity of everything happening. Now, I know you were at the World Economic Forum in Davos very recently. I think the first thing we were going to talk about a bit on COP27, World Economic Forum, they kind of fall into the same boat, right? Leading up to COP27 in November, right, getting more and more clear on this weird realization that it's gotten to the point that both politics and consumer behavior just, I don't use the word fail, that's quite harsh, but have gotten to the point where they just cannot move at the speed and the systems level that sustainability, whether it's decarbonization or whether it's the entire spectrum of UN goals, the decarbonization, environmental, social, and governance factors that they really need. But weirdly, I was clinging onto the optimism, right? That reality and that dawning clarity that they can't move quickly enough gives, again, clarity to the business side. That anyone in business, the right people, the right organizations, the right rooms, they hold the last levers, right? And almost need to get to the point where we're just going to find what people are starting to call coalitions of the willing, right? Just group together, move out in front, drag their systems with them. And myself and quite a few people leading into COP27 were hoping, and that included some people who were involved in the strategy and the running of the summit itself, were almost hoping for a complete implosion, honestly. And the fact that it kind of just happened, and sort of a few good things happen, and we'll talk a bit about them. We'll talk a bit about them soon, whether it's Indonesia's, albeit slow, but starting to move on coal, whether it's the UK giving more and more clarity on transition plans going forward, or whether it's the of loss and damage for the first time, although I think it dawned on most people that it was an unspecified fund up till this point. But a complete disaster would have been better, an implosion, to one, just keep pressing on that clarity, to also sort of restructure the mandate of the UNFCCC, which right now essentially acts as an events management company for COP. But I digress on that front. I would love for JT to chime in and either prove me wrong, fight some optimism. I know some of my optimism from COP, and I hope from the World Economic Forum, came from the individual conversations that were happening on the floor, the desire and the want to collaborate. But please bring some light from your perspective on Davos, on COP, anything to move away from that pretty depressing first 5 minutes that I just about stopped myself going down. a complete tangent and rabbit hole on.
So Joshua, it's such a pleasure to be with you again. Beth, thank you for organizing this and the introduction. I think from my observations, Joshua, from the COP27, that what was reported out is probably a little more optimistic, I think, than some of the points you made. You made a great point about for the first time, there was an agreement on the loss and damage, even though some of the details are still, not to the level of that we would like to see. Especially on Indonesia, I think they've committed about 20 billion, including U.S., Japan, Canada, and some of the European countries have on transitioning, weaning them off the coal into under the Just Energy Transition Partnership in Indonesia. I think that was a tangible. And also, I was excited to see our the former U.S. Vice President Al Gore announce this climate trace in the COP27, which is all AI and satellite data, and they're trying to track all the super polluter locations. Looks like they were able to get to about 80,000 locations, largest emissions locations in worldwide. And one of the insights that came out of it is, half of those, 50% of those, are actually on the top of the list, are actually in the oil and gas field, driven by a lot of flaring, etc. I think on the methane, I think we've seen some positive movement. One thing I was really excited about on the supply chain side, which is relevant for us, is the decarbonizing the global shipping. I think there's been a lot of good discussion and a lot of investments going both from the government and as well as some of the larger organizations about the hydrogen, and I think they're nearly getting to the stage where actually they can commercially viable production of hydrogen is possible, but the transportation and of the hydrogen is still 3 times. It's still not there yet, but I think there is projections anywhere between 5 to 10 years where we can see that technology being commercially viable. So that's an exciting. But also, some of the building on the comment you made, I think I did spend a few days in Davos in the World Economic Forum 23. This was the first time they did in January after the pandemic. Last year they've done in May. But looks like there was around 3,000 delegates, and it's a pre-pandemic level of and all the events and the panel discussions and the keynote speeches and the dinners were packed with people. It was exciting. It was good to see that excitement. And some of the I just want to share a couple of observations from my few days at Davos. Overall, on the global economic outlook, the leaders are still cautious. While most believe that we're in a better place today than what we had feared 3 months ago, the business are still cautious about the slowdown and possible recession, but they remain optimistic. I think some of the China ending its COVID lockdowns, driving growth again in 23, and then inflation numbers are moving in the right direction in the U.S. and Europe. Even though soft landing may be out of question, most believe that economic slowdown and out of the recession will not be as severe as we had anticipated three months ago, which is a positive news. So the war in Ukraine and other geopolitical risks around the world are still creating the polarity, and then in some of the societies is actually creating still anxiety among the business leaders. Again, this is also adding a lot of supply chain risks to many of those companies, so they're worried about that. And then lastly, I was very happy to see a lot of optimism around sustainability and sustainable supply chains. Largely driven by innovation. I think most people are now actually, it is possible. What seemed like a conflicting goals of being able to build resilient supply chains that are, decarbonize supply chains to net zero, at the same time, drive efficiency and at lower cost. These seem like a conflicting goals. But I think by applying the fourth industrial revolution and technology, AI, ML, IoTs, I think there's been pilots that are conducted around the world that tested the hypothesis and then proved that this is actually we can achieve all of these goals and achieve the decarbonize and then net zero while keeping these efficiencies and then supply chain. So that was a positive news that I took away from there.
I mean, it's great to hear. I mean, so many of the things that we could use up this entire session talking about any one point, but we'll try and be kind. But the point about context, one, and a little bit about the war in Ukraine. One of the most fantastic examples recently I've come across, a Ukrainian agriculture firm called Kernel, who have, even in the midst of such a terrible war, have managed to show that if you can align your sustainability strategy right, and I'm not just talking about I'm talking about the dozens and dozens of factors that fall under urbanization, environmental, so biodiversity, wastewater, the social element, so both diversity, but also going sort of through the supply chain, and also I'll add on to that the sort of welfare of your own employees, which I probably don't need to go into detail on exactly why that would matter for such a large Ukrainian, and then talk about sort of risk resiliency. But that aligned approach across all the UN goals, all factors, shows that. So with that contextualized approach and thinking, we'll talk a bit about materiality, I'm sure, today as well. But thinking through, right, what is our role as an organization? What is the industry's role? What is our role as individuals or teams within that organization, within those systems, and very clearly aligning to that global context and thinking through what I've started to call sphere influence, right? You've got your internal sustainability as a company, so decarbonizing yourself and so on. You've got what you do with your customers, your clients, and then you've got the outer ring, which almost to a company, to a person, to anything, way more influential. And it ties in nicely with a services firm like GEP. Right, you are an organization yourselves. You also have an immense of clients, but you and any peer throughout the consulting, technology, and services sector exists at the center of pretty much every organization, every industry, every government, every system on the planet. And given the scale and systems level of change we need, it's a pretty good position to be in right now. I think. I know I had a note in my head to talk a bit about industry. I'd love for you to talk, I don't know, from either a GP perspective or what you've seen at COP or at Davos, that some industries stand out. But I think from my financial services is one, right? Although there's plenty of bad press going around, that there is still far too much financing flowing into industries like oil and gas. And I'm as much of an advocate as anybody for working with your clients to transition rather than cutting ties and letting less public, less caring body fund business as usual. But I do see plenty of activity in finances looking at, right, we touch on this entire portfolio, trillions of dollars, right? And we are going to try, through the road mapping, the materiality assessment, through just sheer collaboration, going to drag you into alignment with the Paris Agreement, broader global sustainability context. I could talk forever on the energy and utilities industries and the gap between where we are now and where we need to be. I mean, some other critical industries I'm sure sort of woven throughout, right? Retail, CPG, manufacturing, all enormous supply chains, as well as agriculture, that I started off this little section on. When it comes to the industry front, I don't know if there's any top of mind thoughts for you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, and as you know, we work across all industries as a horizontal for sustainability. Most of our clients, cut across all the 6 major verticals, and then most of the work that we're doing is actually still largely, like you said, in scope between scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. We're helping a lot of these clients on the scope 3, which is largely in the supply chains outside of the 4 walls of the company. And understanding, and they're struggling a lot with data and understanding how to collect the data and helping them baseline some of those metrics, and then really kind of setting up a roadmap for them on how to going about reducing it. But I think in terms of the verticals, my observation on these verticals is I do see a few verticals kind of leading the pack compared to some others. I mean, there are some specific companies as we CPG and pharma life sciences, I see as two verticals that are actually leading and doing a lot of good work. I mean, not to say there are some pockets of excellence in other verticals as well. Some few companies are role models, but I mean, Unilever, Danone, IKEA, and L'Oreal, Patagonia. These are all kind of the examples that we always talk about. and so forth on the CPG pharma side. And then on the life sciences vertical, actually, we're working with Thomas Edison, who is the chief procurement officer at Bayer, or Bayer, depending on where you are. So he's actually has this supply. He's one of the founding members. Bayer is one of the founding members of what it's called Sustainable Procurement Pledge. It's really focused on the procurement community, SPP, they're conducting on the World Procurement Sustainable Day, which is on the equinox on March 21. They're conducting their second event, major event, which they're anticipating about 10,000 registrants to be part of it. But it's essentially, Danone is also part of the founding member, and then these folks that are actually passionate, they're not waiting for their boards and the C-suite to give them mandates about the targets, about the reporting, and so I think there's a lot that these proactively these individuals are taking proactive initiatives, and then of course on the laggard side, you can oil and gas, as we talked about, is a challenge. Though some of the comments actually we've heard in Davos actually is that there is a balancing act that from their point of view, in many parts of the world, one example that I've heard directly from one of the executives at Chevron is when you turn on the switch, there is a 50% chance the light doesn't come on in some parts of the world because there's no electricity, so there's no energy security for millions and billions of people. So I think balancing that at a commercially viable energy security with the renewable energies and other sources of energy, I think is something that they are see that as the right solution rather than completely turning off, switching over to the non-fossil fuels. So that's some of the observations that we have seen. Now, Josh, I know you work with people across all verticals and very globally with many, and you're constantly in front of them, speaking to many of those. I'm just curious to hear what you're hearing about some of the barriers in accelerating their sustainability programs, especially in their supply chain, from the folks that you've been talking to.
Yeah, well, that question perfectly into the let's call it a mini rant that I was going to go on about oil and gas. So I certainly agree with you that it's too late, and we are so far down the path that we can't not have these firms be part of the solution, right? We just don't have, like, in an ideal world, maybe you'd read it, but right now this is what we've got, and we are already so late. It's the kind of global context is already, you gave an example, but is already so bad for so many people, and it is only going to get worse until we work and we collaborate with our entire ecosystem, with everyone we possibly can, to try and figure out this problem. I think and it kind of ties into a barrier that I've started summing up as the confidence barrier, and it plays out in oil and gas specifically. One of my eternal desires, and I really hope soon that and this is probably going to be in the ballpark for BP, Shell, and Total, right, is to decide to make brave, but I mean, this is not going to be easy. It's going to require some very brave decision making by some very senior people, but to go all in on transparency, right? And there's a visibility, there's a data element that will tie into procurement and supply chain angle later on. But I think one of the last hopes I think the industry has is one triggering an energy transition at the speed and scale and systems level that we need, but also in regaining the trust, right, that it's lost badly over the last 50 or more years. One of those firms going out very publicly disclosing their current transition plan and openly admitting, like, hey, we have not figured this out, right? We do not have the business model that works in a kind of decarbonized UN goal aligned 2050 and beyond, decades after that, and having the confidence that actually that would then allow an ecosystem to coalesce and work with them, because right now no one trusts anything the industry says, right? I think that transparency angle, and I'll come on to the confidence, the data, the visibility barriers second, will give credibility to let's call it the good and the potential for change and for impact through investments and innovation, like stakeholders, they have that investment in their lockers, will give confidence to know that they are being honest and humble about the less aligned, the less great stuff that has happened, but also their potential and the good going forward. And on specifically the confidence barrier, right? What I mean by that is it's become very clear what the global context is, right? We have the UN goals all underpinned by quite detailed roadmaps. We know where we need to go. And I think in all the data and all the conversations I have, there's an agreement that sustainability shouldn't just be viable, right? It should be commercially profitable. And it sounds so soulless to use those terms, but we're kind of in the reality that we are for the time being. So there is that agreement that it should work, but translating that global context and that desire and want to make it work into a business model, a roadmap that work not just is viable and has a written out ROI or a business case in front of them, but gets the key decision makers to a point of confidence that they have that they can make projections, they have the visibility into their supply chains, and honestly they have the backing coming back again to financial services firms, that they have that support and confidence on strategic side, on a financial side, on an operations side, to underpin that transition, right? That's far easier said than done, but I think there's a huge role for, I keep mentioning financial services, but any services fit, right? Consulting, technology, engineering, broad business services. And I know we're probably going to talk a bit about supply chain. Maybe I don't, numbers always float around that, sort of scope value emissions impact is normally about 80%. That's what tend to refer to data, the visibility elements throughout the supply chain on every aspect of the global context, right? But I don't know if there's anything in that you can pick on that brings us back to optimism, or brings us back to the kind of practical work that you can do in getting data, in getting visibility into those supply chains from the point of view of a company who, well, does this for a living, I suppose.
Yeah, no, that's, I think some of the work that we've been doing is really focused on, if you think about the history of GEP, we've spent a lot of time the last 20 years or so on playing with all the third-party spend, and then all the spend analytics, and looking at the spend characteristics by supplier, by plant, by region, by BU, et cetera, et cetera. And now we're able to, last 5 years, take that and then moving that and mapping those spend analytics into emissions analytics, which is really translates into all of the scope 3. And so that's it. So we have a platform that actually does that, and then a lot of clients are actually leveraging, deploying these, which is helping them get to about 95% of accurate baselines on what their scope 3 emissions are. I think I think coming back to the point around, I think the best thing that I think the financial services can do, especially, is really bringing some of the regulation and reporting. I mean, if you think about the financial reporting, it's all GAAP rules, it's all consistent. You can compare two companies, these 3 statements, financial statements, and you can get a very clear picture of what their performance ratings are and how they're performing on various dimensions. I think the intent is there. I think the work is still in progress on. I think that we're all the investing community and working with the government, if they can drive the regulation and the standardization of the metrics and the reporting of the sustainability performance of these companies, and make that reporting mandatory, where they're equally liable, just as any material discrepancies on the financial statements there, and they're liable. And in the same way, if we make that liable, bring that liability on the sustainability side, I know it's still, we're probably a few years away from doing that, especially on scope 3. But I think if we work towards that in the next few years, and that language, I think, is gonna that government regulation and then the financial performance reviews on the sustainability is really going to drive and accelerate some of the, to your point about all the challenges that you talked about on these oil and gas companies, and rebuilding that trust. And I think that mandating those metrics and then the reporting, and will drive that, in my mind, actually, much faster. Than and rebuild some of that lost trust and confidence in the community.
Yeah, Well, you've just mentioned the word metric, and I can see if anyone noticed my kind of eyes switching across the screen, I can see some of the comments and the questions coming in, and one from Neeraj has come in that kind of mentioned this, how to take a holistic approach, right? And one of the things that isn't so much in my head in as much as it just comes across as this enormous problem that there is so much that the global context encompasses, right? I mentioned the kind of decarbonization, the environmental, the social, and governance factors, but all the various geopolitical elements, right? All the industry dynamics. How on earth, as a CEO, a board, someone with a very senior decision-making position, can you take all of that in, align a strategy, and then work through the organization and operationalize it, right? And one of the this was from a HFS data point of view, I mean, this is unchanged since leading up to COP26 in 2021, right? That one of the biggest barriers to implementing sustainability is this complete disconnect, not just throughout organizations, but between organizations, their peers, and the entire global context, right? Trying to take that whole global context, break it down into goals, roadmaps, which by and large we kind of have, and the direction of travel is generally becoming agreed upon for any organization. But then turning those overarching top-level company goals and plans into the metrics, the targets, the incentives, the accountability for all various functions throughout an organization. So think the head of IT, head of supply chain, head of procurement, finance, and then cascading those same metrics and targets all the way throughout an organization down to, say, the person procuring renewable energy, packaging, IT services, could be absolutely anything, but connecting the entire organization and then weaving that back up to the global context. And a lot of that is going to have to be driven by procurement and supply chain, right? I'm not just saying that because I'm with someone from a procurement and supply chain firm. I think one thing I know we keep coming back to the data piece, right? And I mean, part of the reason it seems that there is often, I mean, you can't really blame the entire disconnect on it, but certainly in terms of operation, like let's bring it back to a roadmap, right? On a very basic level, you have a goal, you benchmark your starting point, and you map out the journey there. Trying to benchmark the starting point sort of throughout a massive supply chain, even of your own emissions footprint, right, is very, very difficult. There's a good chance that most of your suppliers won't have the data, certainly that you need, and that's before you start to talk about standardizing it, putting the models in place that then turn supplier data, ecosystem, operational data into the buzzword can I fit in here, sort of real-time decision grade data that, I don't know, an oil refinery will have run its distillation column, for example. We are very far away from being able to make those kinds of decisions on sustainability. But the last thing I'd mention, and it brings us again back to data and a kind of question back to you, JT, is I'm starting to think more and more about, there seem to be too many firms getting overwhelmed by, let's call it perfection, when it comes to data, right? They're thinking, oh, because we don't have the most intricate mapping of our current state of play when it comes to sustainability, we can't really move, we can't really do anything. I'm thinking, well, no, actually, we have the goals in place. I mean, the fact that we have the goals, contrast that to the last 15, 20 years of most organizations chasing this kind of a specter of digital transformation, often without context and often without an endpoint, is a far, far cry from that. And if you're an oil and gas company, or if you're a retail and CPG company, you have a pretty good idea of where the bulk of your emissions are coming from, right? And it might be a struggle to get the data to fully map that last 10%, but by and large, you can make good projections for where 80, 90% of it is, and then you can move. And the data will come, the more that standards mature, the more element there is throughout industries and ecosystems, that will become more of an obvious part of the to-do list. But yeah, I'm curious, like in your conversations when you are discussing, let's say, visibility into supply chains throughout the ecosystem, I mean, like, how much are people really struggling with data, because it kind of tops many of the barrier trees that certainly I see.
Yeah, I think that the problem on the data side is exaggerated on the scope 3 especially, and because it's but I think, like you said, I think there's today, there are technologies, including GEP's technologies and others, that we can take the dollars spent and then convert into metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent on emissions. So you have $100 million spend, or $1 billion spend on travel. I can take that and then just give you about an 80% accurate number on what the emissions would be. But then once I peel the onion and then get to the layers of look at the the details about what that 100 million in travel is, how much is air, how much is car, how much is other elements, and then within the air we can also look at how much is a business class, how much is economy, how much is private jets, and so and the same and so forth. And you can refine it to get to that 95%. But to your point, I think the problem we're trying to address is not to try to be perfect and get to that 98-100% accuracy. All we need to address the issue is get to that 90% point, and then really the bigger challenge after that is what is the roadmap looks like. What is, and everybody talks about net zero by 2050. Many of the people who are actually committing to those will not be probably around by 2050. And probably also not going to be in those roles in 2050. So what's a more relevant question to me is, what is your goals in the next 1, 2, 3, 5 years? And do you have a roadmap to get there? And do you have accurate baselines? Are you making progress towards those short-term goals? I think those are more relevant questions. I think people are still not addressing. I think they're getting to that point on scope 1 and 2 by and large, but then. And also some of the social issues on the, forced labor and some of the, we have a holistic risk assessment framework that actually looks at all of the, not only the emissions like we talked about, but also all the social elements of, which uses the AI technology and the web crawling to understand, all the risks associated with the tier 1, tier 2 suppliers about any protest strikes with the employees, forced labor issues, conflict mineral issues. It highlights all of those risks, and which feeds into the overall ESG score for the company and the risk for the company in their supply chain. So there is a lot of progress that technology has helped us make in the data side. But I think the companies are still dabbling in that area. They haven't made any specific commitments. To your point about getting the cross-functional team, the chief sustainability officer partnering with supply chain officers, and then creating an IT to coming up with the what is that short-term roadmap looks like, and then creating a team to actually focus, a dedicated team to kind of focus on that. I think that's still there's only probably about 20 to 30% of the companies have gotten to that point. But I do want to address some of the question that came on the forum. To the point about it's not a moral issue. I think people are looking for specific business cases around it, and there is a business case. I mean, there are hundreds of pilots that we have seen the data that you can achieve all these what seemingly conflicting goals of lowering your cost while improving your your emissions. And as well as resiliency in the supply chain, and the key to that is actually the technology, both on applying using the enabling technologies as well as some of the innovative technologies of renewable sources to drive that. So I think the people are coming up to. There is, of course, there is going to be an investment. The companies have to make some investments to create that innovation, build those technology solutions that are applicable to the materials and the products. And a lot of products need to be redesigned based on, and a lot of suppliers, they need to collaborate with the suppliers to coming up with the right design, and then also figure out right solutions for the end of life treatment of those products. So there is an investment that's needed. So and that investment needs to come from the investing community, which is essentially is not going to. You don't need to pass it to the consumer, and within 3 years, they're seeing it in the steady state. Actually, those are still cost-effective solutions. Besides all of the the soft benefits of improved reputation and then long-term growth and et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, a few of those points match quite well to the chat that's going up to my right, especially the cross C-suite and the cross ecosystem collaboration. Right, some of the most frightening parts of data that we often get back from the enterprise side is not just the disconnect throughout organizations, but it's almost the lack of very senior leadership. I mean, we frequently get numbers back that maybe 25 to 35% of people, and these sort of senior people, think that their CEOs and their boards at all support the organization's sustainability initiative, right? And if it's not coming from the highest possible level for something that is so systemic that cuts across every business function, every part of the value chain, what hope do we have of that then cascading down through, again, I'll say it, the metrics, targets, accountability, and incentives that you need to link an entire organization up to that company roadmap, up to that or context, right? Pulling it back to a specific point is on best practices and ways to try and trigger that ecosystem collaboration between customers, suppliers, all sorts of different actors throughout a hypothetical value chain. One of my favorite ever quotes, and this comes from the head of procurement at a different European agri-tech agriculture company that I referenced earlier, saying, if I had better data, I would use better data. And what he was referring to was the overwhelming focus on often the end platform and the technology that's being brought onto the platform, right? That technology, it's there, it's fantastic, it's needed. You need the coalescing of that data, you need the analytics, you need the AI, you need everything to make sense of it and make decisions based on it. Everything that underpins that if the data that's coming from your supply chain, from your suppliers, is so bad or like so unstandardized in a pretty useless form, does not link to your overall goals, or it just doesn't exist in the first place, then as, say, the person reporting on sustainability, you might as well just take a standard industry multiplier from any standard and say, well, I'm spending X on this particular part of my remit. I'm just going to multiply it by Y, and then that's what we're going to report, right? And I say sometimes that the data is just non-existent. There does seem to be a lack of trust. I mean, you spend ages trying to define what that lack of trust actually is, but to try and summarize a way to get over that, the more open and transparent, I've mentioned that in the remit of the oil and gas industry, but even value chains, right? An open and transparent conversation between partners about where we are, what we don't know, what the gap between how this value chain works and the future kind of context that we know we need to meet, right? And to remove any kind of fear that any value chain player has, as long as they're genuine and not trying to cover up modern slavery, child labor, serious violations or serious hidden emissions, whatever it might be. But to know that you are not going to be immediately thrown out of a supply chain for having little gaps in your disclosure. And actually, if you are the firm who has power over a value chain, you are that kind of core, like crux that is in the supplies and distributes the products that you're influencing. You can work together, and not just you working together to help people build up that data piece, but you will have a wealth of partners, the likes of say consulting services firms, but also big technology firms, like the big cloud firms, the big enterprise platform firms. They have so much data at their disposal and are trying continuously either open source or bringing that data to their engagements to say, like, look, we are plugged into every organization on the planet. You can think of some example that's pretty true from. That gives you an enormous amount of data to help people, even if it's just those ballpark estimates, get a sense of where they are and what, like you said, JT, what the couple of years, what the next couple of years, what the next 5 years, what the next 10 years of road mapping looks like. So, I mean, in 2 words, transparency and trust. It would solve a lot of problems, but specifically trying more ecosystem collaboration. I'm not going to delve into it, but that's also part, like, some of the frightening data that we get, or the lack of internal collaboration within organizations, let alone when you consider all the potential value chain partners that there are out there. And look, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if you want to sort of save me from myself at this point, JT, and whether there are any good examples that you have in your head, whether it's like we've talked about industry, but whether it's specific companies, specific regulations, anything that is trying to help with this ecosystem collaboration. I mean, GEP for one is in a position where it can help not just bring the data, but just bring people together, right? To coalesce around the table.
No, absolutely. I think, and I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again. In the almost 50 plus years ago, in the Friedman doctrine, the Milton Friedman from University of Chicago, where I went to my business, get my business degree. I have a lot of respect for them, and he has said it in a New York Times article that the social responsibility, again, not fiscal responsibility, the social responsibility of organizations is to maximize shareholder wealth. And that doctrine was followed by all the corporations and all the C-suite for 50 years, like a Bible. And and still today, I think, more than 50% of the organizations still, follow that doctrine. And but that has changed now. That has changed. I see the shift happening. I see the shift happening from the investing community. And the logic behind that statement is that because the CEOs and the management team of an organization are agents working on behalf of the owners or the investors. So, and they cannot exercise their own morality and social responsibility on the organization because they're agents, and because there is a separate organization, which is a taxing agency, which is as a government, and it's their job to do the taxing and then redistribution. Now, it might make sense about 50 years ago when the governments are more powerful. Now there are individuals that are more powerful than many countries in the world. The single individuals have the more wealth and more power than many countries in the world. So the power has shifted and the resources have shifted to the business community. And now the owners are also realizing if we continue the same doctrine, then world is going to getting more and more polarized on the social side. And also on the emission side, there's all these disasters that we're seeing with even at 1.2 degrees today, we're seeing 30% of the Pakistan underwater with the floods. In the first 2 weeks of January, California has seen more rain this January, than the entire last year. So this is on top of the fires that they faced on last year. So I think they're seeing all of these effects, and now the owners have changed their mind and saying, okay, so it's not just the shareholder responsibility. Now I am interested in a more balanced scorecard that includes energy transition and more sustainability on the social side and the environment side. So now that has to trickle down, cascade that down from the boards to the CEOs to the heads of supply chain and the sustainability officers, and that's where we see the journey is actually it's cascading down. It hasn't gotten all the way to the specific targets in the short-term targets that we talked about at the CPO level, at the head of supply chain level. But I think the movement has started, and I do believe that we're going to see some of that. Now, one of the comments actually that came up actually here on the forum is a question around from the World Economic Forum about strengthening metaverse to support global collaboration. So I do want to give an example actually that this is where actually a lot of interest and proven hypotheses at the pilot level. Again, this is not scaled up, but at a corporate level and enterprise level. But there are pilots at a facility level, at a production facility, in various parts of the world where they have applied this technology, like a digital twin. I'm sure many of you heard of, and creating that digital twin. It's in a very I'm oversimplifying, but if you drive a car for 100 miles on autopilot or cruise, you're going to give you a better mileage than manually driving it. It's essentially using the processing controls and the temperature controls and using IoT data. And then if you can do the same thing with the manufacturing process of a production line, and then automate it with IoT and AI and ML, and they're seeing a significant cost reduction and better outcomes on both on the sustainability side. So those are some examples of what how that metaverse can be applied in what I have seen as procurement and supply chain side.
I'm glad you took the metaverse question. You are far more qualified than I am to go into that. What you mentioned just before the metaverse question about the still general lack of metrics and targets for the heads of procurement, the heads of supply chain. When I was doing a series of these talks leading up to COP26 in 2021, so that was the Glasgow conference, and the overwhelming thought that I got was that it's probably 2-3 years away, right? That the overarching company roadmap is being developed, and they thought that's probably going to trickle down to us as procurement and supply chain within 2-3 years. We're basically 2 years down the road, and honestly, nothing is changing. It almost feels like nuclear fusion at the point that it's always 2-3 years away when it comes to these targets. Although I think nuclear fusion is probably a bit further than 2-3 years away. But I'm curious, from when do you think that these targets? It's impossible to put a blanket number on, but in general, does it feel like it's on the doorstep? Is it 2 years away, 5 years away, 10 years away? God forbid, because I think it has to be a two-way conversation, right? Not only do we need to try and work with people at the CEO level to push these targets downwards, hopefully not too forcefully pushed, actually work in partnership with the rest of the function, their organizations. Although, again, we seem to see that collaboration just doesn't exist at the level it needs to, but also need to drive the conversation upwards, right? So if you have a supply chain or a procurement leadership position, you need to be initiating the conversation upwards and show, because that mandate is coming. There's going to be a freak out moment somewhere, like whether it's gradual or whether it's immediate. It's going to happen, and those targets are going to come down. So best to initiate that conversation going upwards and be the let's call it the driver of change rather than the passenger. Oh, sorry, that came out as pretty much as bad as I expected it to, but I'm gonna stand by it.
Yeah, no, I think it's like you said, it's hard to put a number on when majority of the companies, but I do believe even today, majority of the companies on scope 1 and 2, they do have targets. They're working towards it. It's moving, and then most of them tend to be longer term targets. I'd like to see a little more shorter term targets on those. But where the bigger problem I think is really kind of we need to address very quickly is on scope 3. I would say probably less than 30% of the companies have actually any targets or any baselines. So only 30% of the companies are addressing it today. So I think a lot of them has kind of put it on the back burner there. So that's changing. I do see that number was probably 20%, 2-3 years ago, and now it's gone up. I think, but having the targets, having a roadmap is one thing, but really kind of developing the actual innovative solutions that are actually drive the improvements on social, on environment. That's where the still biggest gap is still. I mean, there are some companies. I mean, one example that we've seen in Davos was like Saudi Arabia and the Saudi Aramco is actually investing $100 billion in driving the hydrogen fuel. And a lot of that is still, gray hydrogen, blue hydrogen, not completely green hydrogen, but their own point of view is still, again, we're 10 years away from bringing a technology that's actually going to be commercially viable for that. So those solutions are, but the investments are taking place now, and the commitments and towards that innovation is already teams are working towards it. So I'm happy to see some of the large corporations are doing it, in addition to some of the government, including the government of India is actually betting a lot on that hydrogen fuel as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it'd be nice. I mean, as much as 100 billion times, like I probably wish that Saudi Aramco would put a bit more into developing hydrogen and moving away. I don't, for those that many of you listening might not, because it struck me by surprise when I first realized it, that Saudi Aramco has a market cap 10 times the size and an output or a production about 4 times the size of ExxonMobil. I think we often have system changing conversations where we look to the likes, right, what could we potentially get an Exxon, a Chevron, and I mentioned earlier, could we get a BP, a Shell, or a Total to move first and really trigger some kind of systemic level collaboration and a more aligned energy transition to where we know we need to be. But I can only hope that more public and more kind of open to scrutiny companies can have that change and drag firms like Saudi Aramco on. There's definitely movement. Don't get me wrong, but given the current state of play and the tipping points and the state that we're expecting over the next, well, obviously this year, without wanting to be too down, but that's exactly where we are, right? We are facing these tipping points, and we're unlikely to hit 1.5 degrees in temperature rise this year, but within 5 years, there's a fair chance that we will hit that, right? And I think the overriding view is that 1.5 certainly by 2050 might not be the most achievable goal, but for all that it's worth and all the time and the energy that I think we and anyone listening here has, we need to try and sort of limit, or the question is really now, rather than just looking at some arbitrary temperature, go, how bad is it going to get for how many people before we can figure this out and hope, well, at some point in the future have the technology to drag things back. But I think we're getting close to the end, and I don't know if you had any. We've pretty much covered, I think, most of the themes that are coming through. I don't know if you have any sort of something that's nearing a final thought or anything that we haven't touched on. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment and get your thoughts also, Joshua. And there's a question on the group around supplier collaborations and the third-party collaborations. And I do see, I gave you one example on the sustainable procurement pledge where, hundreds of companies and the chief procurement officer decided to voluntarily take that on and then work. And we are part of that partnership as well with the CPOs. And their goal is actually, they've already communicated to all their supply base, tier 1 supply base, and about their own individual goals on scope 3. And not, this is again, what they want to achieve in 23, 24, very short-term goals. And then, and they're also requesting the suppliers to partner with them to, publicly share scientific, science-based targets of their tier 1 suppliers, and work with them on, there's a lot of collaborative opportunities on driving joint process improvements. And like I said, some of the products need to be redesigned, taking these, both environment and the social aspects into account. And so there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for collaborations with the suppliers in driving that. So that's one example that I wonder, just curious about what you're seeing in terms of the collaborations with not only just the supply base, but also any other partners ecosystem.
Yeah, that was one of my only vaguely optimistic predictions. I mean, you never use the word prediction, right? For what it's worth, predictions for 2023 that we would see more just coalitions of the willing. I used that phrase right at the start of this session, and more of the right people in the right organizations in the right rooms just coming together across their industries, across their supply chains, value chain systems, to almost just unapologetically think, right, what can we do? Because we're not going to get the help from policy making. Consumer behavior is not going to be able to shift quickly enough to address the kind of speed and systems level that we need. So actually, as just quote business, the kind of collective, what can we do? Actually, we can move at that speed and systems level that we need, or at least I really hope that we can. So it's good, like the initiatives that there are even examples in oil and gas, right, of some of the biggest firms collaborating around human rights data and coming together and helping their supply chains to disclose and improve their visibility and their transparency into the practices around oil, coal, and gas supply chains. And you can find examples of throughout chemicals, throughout retail and CPG, throughout pretty much every industry if you look deeply enough. But that is my overriding shout, as well as a few other things that I could maybe squeeze towards the end. But again, I'll reference the three spheres of influence, right? If you are an individual, if you're thinking about your team or your organization, right, you've got your own internal sustainability. and that will have a footprint and it needs to be addressed. You will have customers, but your opportunity to work throughout your value chain, just grab a hold of any person, any partner that you can, and come together and figure out, right, how can we be part of that critical mass that moves first, sets the standard that the rest of the industry, but also that politics and the public will have to be brought into alignment with, because we're not even running out of time at this point. We ran out of time, well, you could say decades ago, but that's a separate conversation.
That's good summary. So just my closing thoughts, Joshua. I think for many of the companies and individuals who are very passionate about the topic and want to make that change, I think it is important to gain that C-level sponsorship towards these initiatives. I think it's also gain their sponsorship for commitments and also some investments. And it's also important to, at the beginning, to leverage some SMEs in the market. There are quite a few SMEs, and GEP is one of them, both on the technology side and then on helping come up with a proper baseline of your scorecards and coming up with a well-balanced scorecard on the environmental, social, and the governance side. And then, but by each vertical has its own metrics, and then they have to be very relevant to the vertical that you're in, and also the geographies that you operate in. Coming up with the right the metrics, but then the third step, the most important step, is actually then assembling a cross-functional team, and then coming up with the roadmap. There's a roadmap for 3-5 years, what that roadmap looks like, and what improvements and what improvements can you commit to, and so forth. So that's where all of the that has to be done in collaboration with the suppliers and partners, and then and cross-functional teams within the organization. And then lastly, I think applying the technology, leveraging the technology to automate some of these data collection processes, emission factors, application of those, converting them into the both emissions and as well as collecting the data on the social metrics and reporting them on a very consistent, repeatable basis. I think technology has come a long way in helping. So that would be my advice for some of the folks that are looking to make the change within their organization.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Josh and JT, for your time and insights. We really unpacked a lot in our short time here. Some takeaways that I took from the discussion was that this is a dynamic space with changes happening, such as climate tracing with AI, or decarbonization of the carbon shipping, and that collaboration is key to build the ecosystem, as well as procurement and supply chain leaders can be agents for sustainable change within their organization. If any of you would like to check out some additional insights on our sustainability practice, there's a lot of information available on GEP.com. So our call to action to you is to go check that out. And then in addition, we have an upcoming LinkedIn Live on Monday, January 31st at 1 p.m. Eastern. And it's on conquering 2023 supply chain setbacks. So look forward to seeing you all on that one as well. And thank you again so much for your time in participating in today's session.
Hey, thanks so much, Beth. Thanks, JT.
Yeah, it was great chatting with you, Joshua. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.